After I refused to go on a trip with my wife's abusive brother, my wife's mother kicked me off the $30,000 Dubai trip I paid for just to give my seat to my wife's ex-boyfriend. She said, "He's more fun anyways." Big mistake. I made sure they'd never forget. What happened next? You know that feeling when your whole world shifts in the span of a text message? Yeah, well, that's exactly what happened to me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my office, pretending to care about quarterly reports. My name's Marcus Linwood, and I'm about to tell you how one message from my mother-in-law turned my life upside down and taught me the most expensive lesson I've ever learned about family loyalty. The text came in at 2:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was watching the clock, counting down the minutes until I could leave early and surprise Rachel with dinner reservations at that fancy steakhouse she'd been eyeing. My phone buzzed, and when I saw Deborah's name pop up, I figured it was something about our upcoming Dubai trip. Maybe she wanted to know what time we were meeting at the airport or if she should pack sunscreen. You know, normal mother-in-law stuff. But this wasn't normal. Not even close. "We've decided Asher will take your seat. He's more fun anyway." I stared at that message for what felt like forever, reading it over and over again, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But they didn't. They just sat there on my screen, each word hitting me like a punch to the gut. No, "Hey Marcus," at the beginning. No, "Sorry, but we need to talk," or even a half-hearted explanation. Just a cold, matter-of-fact statement delivered like she was telling me the weather forecast. Asher. Of all the people in the world, they chose Asher Dean to take my place on a trip I'd been planning and paying for since last Christmas. This is the same guy who used to corner me at family barbecues and call me discount husband, while everyone else laughed it off like it was just harmless fun. The same jackass who thought it was hilarious to shove me into the pool at Rachel's cousin's wedding while I was wearing my best suit, then act like I was being dramatic when I didn't find it funny. The same ex-boyfriend who treated my wife like garbage for 3 years before I came along and showed her what real love looked like. And now he was more fun than me. The guy who paid for first-class tickets to Dubai for the entire family. The guy who'd been busting his ass for months to plan the perfect vacation that would maybe, just maybe, help me win over Rachel's family once and for all. I set my phone down and leaned back in my office chair, trying to process what had just happened. 2 weeks. We were supposed to leave in 2 weeks, and suddenly I wasn't invited to my own damn vacation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been working overtime for the past 3 months to pay for this trip, sacrificing weekends and late nights with Rachel so I could make sure everyone had the experience of a lifetime. 10 days in Dubai with all the bells and whistles, first-class flights, 5-star accommodations, desert safaris, yacht cruises, and that dinner-in-the-sky experience that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But here's the thing that really twisted the knife. This whole trip was supposed to be my olive branch to Rachel's family. Her brother Colin had made it crystal clear from day one that he thought his sister could do better than me, and Deborah had this passive-aggressive way of making me feel like an outsider at every family gathering. I thought if I could show them how much I loved Rachel, how much I was willing to invest in our relationships, maybe they'd finally accept me as part of the family. Instead, they handed my seat over to the one person who represented everything I wasn't in their eyes, the smooth-talking charmer who could make everyone laugh, even when he was being a complete ass. Asher had this way of walking into a room and commanding attention, telling stories that probably weren't even true, but had everyone hanging on his every word. Meanwhile, I was the quiet guy in the corner, the one who actually showed up when Rachel needed someone, who remembered her mom's birthday and sent flowers, who fixed her dad's computer without being asked. I picked up my phone again and scrolled up through our text history with Deborah. There were months of messages about the trip, me asking about dietary restrictions, sharing hotel options, coordinating flight times. She'd been enthusiastic about everything, thanking me for my generosity and telling Rachel how lucky she was to have such a thoughtful husband. And now, with one text, all of that was gone. The worst part? I knew exactly how this had gone down. Colin had probably suggested inviting Asher, maybe as a friend, to round out the group. Then they all sat around discussing it like I wasn't even a factor in the equation. Like my feelings, my money, my role as Rachel's husband didn't matter. They probably convinced themselves they were doing me a favor by not making me deal with Asher for 10 days, not realizing, or maybe not caring, that they were basically telling me I didn't belong in my own wife's family. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside me. For years, I'd been the accommodating son-in-law, always bending over backward to keep the peace, swallowing my pride whenever Colin made his snide comments or Deborah treated me like hired help. But this was different. This was them crossing a line I didn't even know existed until they'd already stepped over it. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Deborah. It was Rachel. Mom told me about the Dubai thing. Don't make it weird, okay? Asher's just easier to travel with. Easier to travel with. Right. I guess paying for everyone's trip doesn't make you easy to travel with. I guess being reliable and responsible doesn't count for much when you're competing with someone who knows how to work a crowd. I didn't text back. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up a new spreadsheet. At the top, I typed Dubai undo. And right then and there, I started planning the most expensive lesson my wife's family would ever learn about taking me for granted. Let me paint you a picture of just how much money we're talking about here, because I think it's important you understand the scale of what I was dealing with. This wasn't some weekend getaway to the beach or a quick trip to Vegas. This was a $30,000, once-in-a-lifetime experience that I'd been planning since Rachel mentioned last Christmas how she'd always dreamed of seeing Dubai with her family. I remember the exact moment she said it. We were sitting around her parents' dining room table, picking at leftover turkey and listening to Colin complain about his latest job interview disaster, when Rachel got this wistful look in her eyes and said, "You know what would be amazing? Taking everyone to Dubai for New Year's. Just once. I'd love to experience something that incredible with all the people I care about most." The way she said it, with that little smile that made her eyes light up, man, I was hooked immediately. I started researching that very night, staying up until 3 in the morning comparing hotels and reading reviews, trying to figure out how to make her dream come true. Because that's what you do when you love someone, right? You move mountains to make them happy, even when those mountains cost more than most people's cars. First-class flights for 6 people from LAX to Dubai International. Do you know what those run during peak season? Try $5,000 per person minimum. But I didn't want Rachel's parents cramped up in economy for 14 hours, and I sure as hell wasn't going to be the cheap son-in-law who booked coach while expecting everyone to be grateful. So first class it was, complete with lie-flat seats and champagne service that Frank kept talking about for weeks after I booked everything. Then there was the hotel. Not just any hotel, mind you. The Burj Al Arab, the one that looks like a giant sail and calls itself the world's only 7-star resort. Rachel had this photo of it saved on her phone for years, always talking about how it was her dream to stay there someday. The royal suite was booked solid, but I managed to snag 3 ocean suites at $2,500 a night each. That's $75,000 just for accommodations. But the look on Rachel's face when I showed her the confirmation email was worth every penny. And the experiences? Jesus, I went all out. Desert safari with private guides and a traditional Bedouin dinner under the stars. Yacht cruise around the Palm Jumeirah with an open bar and a personal chef. Shopping tours through the Gold Souk and the world's largest mall. Helicopter ride over the city at sunset. And the Piece de Resistance. Dinner in the sky, suspended 160 feet above Dubai Marina while 5-star chefs prepared a 7-course meal. That one experience alone cost more than most people spend on their entire vacation. I had spreadsheets for everything. Flight times coordinated so everyone could sit together. Restaurant reservations at all the places Rachel had bookmarked on Instagram. Spa appointments for the ladies, golf for Frank and Colin, even tickets to that fountain show that everyone says you have to see. I spent months researching, planning, coordinating, making sure every single detail was perfect. But here's the thing that really gets me. I didn't do any of this because I had money to burn or because I wanted to show off. I did it because I genuinely thought this trip would be the thing that finally brought us all together as a real family. I thought maybe if I showed them how much I cared about Rachel, how much I was willing to invest in all of us having incredible memories together, they'd finally see me as more than just the guy their daughter settled for. I imagined us laughing together over dinner, sharing stories about our adventures, taking those cheesy family photos in front of the Burj Khalifa that Rachel would frame and put on our mantle. I pictured Colin finally warming up to me after we bonded over some shared experience, and Deborah maybe admitting that she'd been wrong about me all along. Hell, I even thought Frank and I might actually have a real conversation for once, instead of those awkward exchanges about the weather and how the Lakers were doing. But instead of appreciation, instead of gratitude for the months of planning and the small fortune I'd invested in making Rachel's dream come true, I got a text message telling me my seat was being given to her ex-boyfriend. The same ex-boyfriend who used to make Rachel cry herself to sleep, who cheated on her with her college roommate, who came crawling back every few months whenever he got lonely or bored. "Don't make it a big deal," Rachel had said when she finally called me that night. "Asher's just better company on trips. He knows how to have fun, and honestly, you can be kind of intense sometimes. Maybe it's better this way. You can stay home and relax, and we'll bring you back something nice. Better this way." Like I was some kind of burden they were doing a favor by excluding. Like the guy who'd spent $30,000 in months of his time planning their dream vacation was somehow the problem. And the kicker? She actually seemed annoyed that I wasn't more understanding about the whole situation. "It's not like you're losing money," she said when I brought up the cost. "The trip's already paid for, and honestly, Asher will probably appreciate it more than you would anyway. You know how you get about trying new foods and staying up late, right? Because being a responsible adult who doesn't drink until 3 in the morning and make an ass of himself means I can't appreciate a luxury vacation. Because preferring to actually remember the experiences I'm paying for instead of blacking out every night means I'm no fun." That night, I sat in my home office with all the confirmation emails pulled up on my computer, looking at months of careful planning and financial investment. Everything was under my name, paid for with my credit cards, booked through my accounts. Rachel's family might have thought they could just swap me out for someone more entertaining, but they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about taking people for granted. I opened up a new spreadsheet and titled it Dubai Undo. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I actually smiled. Sitting there in my office, staring at that Dubai Undo spreadsheet, my mind started wandering to all the other ways Rachel's family had been taking advantage of me over the years. And let me tell you, once you start pulling at that thread, the whole damn sweater unravels pretty quickly. The condo situation was probably the biggest example of how naive I'd been about their true feelings toward me. About 3 years back, Frank lost his job at the shipping company where he'd worked for 15 years. Downsizing, they called it, though everyone knew it was really about shipping jobs overseas to save a few bucks. Frank was devastated. The man had worked his ass off for that company, putting in overtime and weekends, missing family dinners and school plays, all for the promise of a secure retirement that got yanked away when some MBA in a boardroom decided his salary was too expensive. Rachel was beside herself watching her dad struggle. He was 58 years old, which is apparently the perfect age to be considered too old by most employers, but too young to retire. The unemployment benefits barely covered their mortgage, and Deborah was working part-time at a boutique that paid just above minimum wage. They were looking at losing their house, the same house where Rachel grew up, where all her childhood memories lived. So what did I do? I bought a second condo. Not just any condo, a beautiful 2-bedroom place in a gated community about 20 minutes from their old house. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a balcony overlooking a little man-made lake with a fountain. The kind of place that would have been a dream home for most people. I put down the full 20%, signed all the paperwork, and handed Frank the keys with a simple arrangement. "Live there rent-free until you get back on your feet. Then we'll figure out something fair. You're saving our family," Deborah said that day, actually tearing up as she hugged me. "Rachel's so lucky to have found someone like you." Frank shook my hand with both of his, the way he did when he was really emotional, and told me I was the son he'd always wanted. Even Colin, who usually treated me like something he'd scraped off his shoe, admitted that what I was doing was pretty cool, and that maybe he'd misjudged me. For about 6 months, it was perfect. Frank found some consulting work, nothing permanent, but enough to cover groceries and utilities. They kept the place immaculate, sent me photos of how they decorated it, invited Rachel and me over for dinner every Sunday. Deborah would cook these elaborate meals and tell everyone who'd listen about her generous son-in-law who'd save them from financial ruin. But then Colin got evicted from his apartment. I should have seen the red flags immediately, but I was still in that hopeful phase where I thought Rachel's family was starting to accept me. Colin showed up at the condo with a U-Haul and a sob story about how his roommate had screwed him over, how he just needed a place to crash for a few weeks until he could get back on his feet. And like an idiot, I said yes. Those few weeks turned into months, which turned into years. Colin treated the place like his personal bachelor pad, leaving pizza boxes on the counter and beer cans on the coffee table, bringing home different women at all hours of the night. When I'd stop by to check on things, he'd barely acknowledge me, sometimes not even bothering to put on a shirt when he answered the door. "Thanks for letting me crash here, bro," he'd say, but there was always this undertone of entitlement, like I owed him something instead of the other way around. Like I was his landlord instead of his sister's husband who was doing his family a massive favor. And the money situation? Well, that started falling apart pretty quickly too. At first, Frank would slip me a couple $100 here and there, apologizing that it wasn't more, but promising things would get better soon. I always told him not to worry about it, that family helps family, that we'd settle up when he was more stable. But as time went on, those payments became less frequent and smaller amounts. 200 became 100, then 50, then nothing at all. Instead of apologies, I started getting excuses. The consulting work was inconsistent. Deborah's hours had been cut. Colin was between jobs and couldn't contribute. There was always something, always a reason why this month was different and why next month would be better. Meanwhile, I was covering the mortgage, the HOA fees, the property taxes, the maintenance costs. When the air conditioning unit died in the middle of summer, guess who got the $4,000 repair bill? When the washer and dryer needed to be replaced, guess who drove to Home Depot and arranged the delivery? When the Homeowners Association sent violation notices because Colin kept parking his rusty pickup truck in the guest spot instead of the assigned space, guess who had to deal with the fines and the angry letters? $21,300. That's what I calculated they owed me over 4 years of basically free housing, not including the opportunity cost of what I could have made renting the place to actual tenants, or the wear and tear from Colin treating it like a frat house. Just the basic costs of keeping them housed and comfortable while they figured their lives out. And how did they repay this generosity? By giving my seat on a $30,000 vacation to Rachel's ex-boyfriend because he was more fun. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not just about the money, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the fundamental disrespect, the way they'd taken everything I'd given them and then decided I wasn't worth keeping around when something better came along. They'd smiled to my face for years, thanked me for my generosity, called me family, all while secretly thinking I was some kind of pushover they could manipulate whenever they needed something. And Rachel? My own wife had gone along with it. She'd watched her family take advantage of me for years and never once stood up for me, never once told them they were crossing a line. When I'd mentioned how frustrated I was getting with the condo situation, she'd just shrugged and said that's what family does for each other. But apparently, that generosity only flowed in one direction. I opened up another spreadsheet and titled it Debt Ledger. At the top, I created columns for Deborah, Rachel, Colin, and Frank. And for the first time in years, I started adding up exactly what being part of this family had cost me. The numbers were staggering, and they were about to learn that everything comes with interest. You know what they say about curiosity and cats? Well, sometimes being curious is exactly what you need to uncover just how deep the betrayal really goes. After spending the night stewing over that text from Deborah and doing math on just how much money I'd invested in people who clearly didn't give a damn about me, I decided I needed to know exactly how they'd pulled off this little CSW. Paying attention to details. I work in project management for a tech company, which means I'm obsessively organized about everything, especially when it comes to something as complicated and expensive as international travel. Every confirmation number, every booking reference, every tiny detail about our Dubai trip was saved in multiple folders on my computer and phone. I knew those reservations like the back of my hand. So the next morning, I called Emirates directly. Not the general customer service line where you get stuck on hold for 45 minutes listening to elevator music, but the premium customer service number they give you when you book first-class tickets. The kind of service where they answer on the second ring and call you Mr. Linwood, like you're somebody important. "Good morning, Mr. Linwood," the representative said in that crisp British accent that makes everything sound more professional. "How may I assist you today?" I played it cool, like I was just a concerned traveler double-checking his booking. "Hi there, I just wanted to verify my reservation for the Dubai flight on the 15th. Confirmation number EM4471X. just making sure everything's still in order. There was a pause, the sound of typing, then a longer pause that made my stomach start to twist. I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Linwood, but I'm showing that reservation was marked as canceled due to a medical emergency. According to our notes, a woman claiming to be your wife called our customer service line 3 days ago and reported that you had been hospitalized and would be unable to travel. The world went a little sideways for a second. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking my morning coffee like it was any other day, and suddenly I felt like I was falling through space. "Excuse me," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone called and said I was hospitalized?" "Yes, sir." The caller provided your booking reference and personal information to verify the account, then requested an emergency name change to transfer the reservation to a Mr. Asher Dean. However, and here the representative's voice took on a slightly apologetic tone, "I should inform you that such transfers are not actually permitted under our policies, regardless of the circumstances. We should have advised the caller to cancel your reservation and book a new one under Mr. Dean's name." My coffee cup was halfway to my mouth, but my hand had stopped working properly. Asher Dean. They'd actually tried to transfer my $30,000 first-class reservation to Rachel's ex-boyfriend by claiming I was in the hospital. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "What happened when Mr. Dean tried to check in?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Well, that's where we encountered some difficulties. Mr. Dean arrived at LAX yesterday evening and attempted to check in using your confirmation number and his own identification. Our system flagged it immediately as a security concern. Different name on the ID than on the reservation, you understand. When our ground staff questioned him about it, he became quite agitated and claimed there had been some sort of family emergency that required the last-minute change. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Asher, that smooth-talking charmer who thought he could talk his way out of anything, had been caught red-handed trying to use my identity to board an international flight. In a post, 9/11 world, that's not the kind of thing airport security takes lightly. Was he able to board the flight? I asked. Oh no, absolutely not. We had to contact airport security due to the suspicious nature of the attempt. I believe he was detained for questioning, though I don't have the details of what happened after that. The reservation remains canceled, and frankly, sir, we were quite concerned about you. If you're well enough to be calling us, should we be contacting the authorities about this fraudulent claim? And there it was. The smoking gun. Rachel or someone in her family had actually called Emirates, impersonated my wife, lied about me being hospitalized, and tried to illegally transfer my reservation to another person. That's not just being inconsiderate or rude. That's actual fraud. Identity theft. The kind of thing that can land you in federal prison when it involves international travel and airport security. You know what? I said, suddenly feeling calmer than I had since this whole mess started. I think I would like to file a formal complaint about this. Can you transfer me to your security department? For the next hour, I gave a detailed statement to Emirates' fraud investigation team. I provided screenshots of Deborah's text message, explained the family relationship and the context of the trip, and confirmed that I had never authorized anyone to make changes to my reservation or claim that I was hospitalized. They were very interested in the whole story, especially when I mentioned that the person who'd made the fraudulent call had access to my personal information through family connections. By the time I hung up, I had a case number, a direct contact for the investigator who'd be handling my complaint, and a promise that Emirates would be cooperating fully with any law enforcement agencies that might want to pursue charges. They also offered to reinstate my original reservation if I was still interested in traveling. Though at this point, the last thing I wanted was to spend 10 days in Dubai with people who'd just committed fraud to get rid of me. But the best part? The absolute cherry on top of this whole twisted Sunday. When I asked about the rest of the group's reservations, the representative informed me that Deborah, Frank, Colin, and Rachel were all still scheduled to fly out that evening. They were probably at the airport right now, waiting to board a plane with their non-existent hotel reservations and canceled excursions, thinking they'd successfully ditched the guy who'd been funding their entire vacation. I hung up the phone and just sat there for a few minutes, processing what I'd learned. They hadn't just been rude or thoughtless. They'd committed actual crimes to exclude me from a trip I'd paid for. They'd lied to an international airline, impersonated my wife, filed false medical claims, and put Asher in a position where he'd been detained by airport security for attempting to use fraudulent travel documents. And they'd done all of this because they thought I wasn't fun enough. I opened my laptop and created a new document titled Fraud Documentation. Time to start keeping a very detailed record of everything. Because if Rachel's family wanted to play hardball, they were about to discover that the quiet, accommodating son-in-law they'd been taking advantage of for years had just learned how to swing back. And I was aiming for the fences. There's something almost therapeutic about methodically dismantling months of careful planning when you realize the people you were planning for don't give a shit about you. I spent the next 4 hours on the phone, and let me tell you, it was some of the most satisfying work I've ever done. I started with the hotel, because that was going to be the biggest shock to their system. The Burj Al Arab doesn't just let anyone walk in off the street and demand a room, especially not during peak season when they're booked solid months in advance. I'd had to pull some serious strings and pay premium rates just to secure those 3 ocean suites, and now I was about to make them disappear with a phone call. Mr. Linwood, the hotel manager, Ahmed, sounded genuinely happy to hear from me. We'd been corresponding for months about special arrangements for the trip. I trust everything is in order for your arrival this evening. Actually, Ahmed, I need to cancel the entire reservation. All 3 suites, the spa appointments, the restaurant bookings, everything. There was a pause. I'm very sorry to hear that, sir. I hope there hasn't been a family emergency. You could say that, I thought. Something like that. The trip isn't happening as planned. Of course, Mr. Linwood. However, I should remind you that these are non-refundable reservations, given the premium nature of the accommodations and the short notice. The cancellation fee will be. I don't care about the money, I said, and meant it. I just want to make sure that no one in my party will be able to check in without me physically present. Can you add a note to the reservation that I must be there in person to authorize any access to the rooms? Certainly, sir. I'll flag the entire booking immediately. Without your personal authorization, no one will be permitted to check in, regardless of what identification or documentation they might present. Perfect. I could just picture Rachel and her family showing up at one of the most exclusive hotels in the world, tired from a 14-hour flight, expecting to walk into luxury suites that no longer existed. The Burj Al Arab isn't the kind of place that has extra rooms lying around for walk-ins, especially not during New Year's week. Next up were the excursions, and this is where I really started to enjoy myself. Desert safari with Al Maha Desert Resort? Cancelled. The private yacht charter around Palm Jumeirah? Gone. Helicopter. You know that feeling when you're watching a train wreck in slow motion? That's exactly what it was like sitting in my living room at 3:07 a.m., watching my phone light up with increasingly frantic messages from Dubai. I'd been expecting this, of course, had actually been lying awake wondering when the first panic call would come through. But seeing it all unfold in real time was more satisfying than I'd imagined. The first text came from Colin, and I could practically feel the confusion and anger radiating through the screen. Dude, what the hell? They're saying there's no reservation at the hotel. The guy at the front desk literally laughed at us when we showed him our confirmation emails. This is seriously messed up. I set the phone down and made myself a cup of tea, taking my time with each step. Boiling the water, selecting the right mug, letting the tea steep for exactly 4 minutes. By the time I picked up my phone again, there were 6 more messages waiting for me. Deborah was next. Marcus, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this isn't funny. We've been traveling for 16 hours, and we're exhausted. The concierge says all our reservations have been canceled. The spa, the restaurants, even the airport pickup service. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake. A mistake. Right. Like accidentally spending months planning a $30,000 vacation for people who think so little of you that they'd rather commit fraud than travel with you is the kind of oopsie that just happens. Rachel's messages started coming through around 3:15. Marcus? There's no hotel. The guy at the desk laughed at us. What did you do? Call me back right now. The beauty of international time zones meant I could take my sweet time responding to each crisis as it unfolded. While they were dealing with the immediate catastrophe of being stranded in Dubai with no accommodations, I was sitting comfortably in my home office, documenting everything for my records. Frank tried to be diplomatic in his approach. Son, I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Could you please call the hotel and straighten this out? We're willing to work things out when we get home, but right now we just need a place to sleep. Son. He called me son. The same man who'd been living rent-free in my condo for 4 years, whose family had just committed federal crimes to exclude me from a trip I'd paid for, was asking me to fix their accommodation crisis and calling me son while he did it. But it was the message about Asher that really made my night. By the way, Asher broke his arm falling off a camel. Do you even care? Rachel's crying, and we're stuck in some emergency room that doesn't even speak English properly. The medical bills are insane and our insurance doesn't work here. I had to read that one twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Asher, the same Asher who was supposedly more fun than me, who was such great travel company that they'd committed fraud to bring him instead, had managed to break his arm on what was probably the only excursion they'd been able to book last minute after discovering all their original plans had been canceled. The irony was delicious. They'd replaced me with someone who was going to cost them thousands in emergency medical bills in a foreign country, while I was sitting at home, perfectly safe and increasingly entertained by their misfortune. The messages kept coming throughout the night, each one more desperate than the last. Apparently, finding decent hotel rooms in Dubai during New Year's week when you don't have reservations is roughly equivalent to finding unicorns. The few places that had availability were either complete dumps in sketchy neighborhoods or luxury resorts charging premium rates that made my original bookings look like budget options. The only place we could find is some sketchy motel near the airport. Colin texted around 4 a.m. It smells like cigarettes and the air conditioning doesn't work. There's literally a roach in the bathroom. Rachel hasn't stopped crying since we got here. Good. Maybe now she'd understand what it felt like to have something you were looking forward to completely destroyed by people who were supposed to care about you. Deborah tried a different approach around 5 a.m. Marcus, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your behavior. This is cruel and vindictive. Rachel's your wife, and you're destroying her dream vacation out of spite. Is this really the kind of man you want to be? Cruel and vindictive. That's rich, coming from the woman who'd texted me that my seat was being given to someone else because he was more fun anyway. The woman who'd helped orchestrate fraud against an international airline to exclude me from a trip I'd planned and paid for. But it was Rachel's final message of the night that really showed me how completely they still didn't get it. You're being so petty right now. Yes, maybe we handled the Asher thing wrong, but you're literally ruining everyone's vacation because your feelings got hurt. This is exactly why we thought he'd be better company. You always make everything about you. I read that message 3 times, each time feeling a little more clarity about what I was dealing with. Even now, even after discovering that all their plans had been canceled, even after spending a night in a roach-infested motel near the airport, Rachel still thought this was about my hurt feelings. She still thought I was being petty and dramatic. She didn't understand that this wasn't about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about respect. This was about the fundamental recognition that you don't treat people like garbage and then expect them to keep funding your lifestyle. This was about consequences for actions, something her family seemed to have avoided for most of their lives. I opened my laptop and added a new entry to my documentation spreadsheet. January 1st, 3:07 a.m. First contact from Dubai. Subjects discovering consequences of their choices. Asher hospitalized with broken arm. Group stranded without accommodations. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing or understanding of situation. Then I turned off my phone, poured myself another cup of tea, and went to bed. Tomorrow, I had some phone calls to make about the condo situation. Tonight, I was going to sleep better than I had in years, knowing that for the first time since I joined this family, the people who'd been taking advantage of me were finally experiencing what it felt like to face the consequences of their actions. And honestly, they deserved every uncomfortable minute of it. There's something to be said for the power of silence. 4 or 5 days after the Dubai disaster, I didn't respond to a single text, email, or voicemail from Rachel's family. Not one. I let them stew in their own mess while I took some time to plan my next moves and, honestly, just enjoy the peace and quiet of not having to deal with their drama for once. They finally made it back to LA on January 6th, 3 days later than originally planned, and about $15,000 poorer after paying for emergency flights, last-minute hotel rooms, and Asher's medical bills. I know this because I've been monitoring the condo's security cameras, and I watched Colin's beat-up pickup truck pull into the driveway that Tuesday afternoon, followed by Frank and Deborah's sedan. I gave them exactly 2 hours to get settled and cleaned up before I made my appearance. Enough time to unpack, maybe grab a shower, definitely enough time to start thinking they were safe back in their rent-free sanctuary. Then I knocked on the door of my own property, carrying a manila folder that contained the most important document any of them had seen in years. Colin answered the door, looking like he'd been through a blender. His usual cocky swagger was nowhere to be found, replaced by exhaustion and what I can only describe as shell shock. The golden boy who'd thought he was so clever helping to orchestrate my exclusion from the Dubai trip now looked like a man who'd learned some hard truths about consequences. "Oh," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's you." "Yeah, it's me. The guy whose property you've been living in for free for the past 4 years. Can I come in?" He stepped aside without a word, and I walked into what had once been a pristine condo and was now clearly Colin's personal disaster zone. Pizza boxes on the kitchen counter, beer cans lined up on the coffee table, some woman's makeup scattered across the bathroom sink that was visible from the living room. It looked like a frat house, not a home where responsible adults lived. Frank and Deborah emerged from the master bedroom looking every bit as worn down as Colin. Deborah had clearly been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she kept dabbing at her nose with a tissue. Frank looked older somehow, like the stress of the past week had aged him 5 years. "Marcus," Frank said, attempting his usual warm smile, but falling short. "We need to talk about what happened in Dubai. I think there's been a big misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" "Right. Like accidentally committing federal fraud is something that just happens when communication gets mixed up." "Actually," I said, setting the manila folder down on the coffee table after moving aside a stack of Colin's dirty dishes, "I think we need to talk about what's going to happen right here. Starting now." I opened the folder and pulled out 3 copies of a document I'd spent considerable time crafting with my attorney's help. Standard residential lease agreement, completely legal and fair by every measure, but probably shocking to people who'd gotten used to living somewhere for free. "What's this?" Deborah asked, though her voice suggested she already knew and didn't like it. "It's a lease agreement," I said, sliding copies across the table to each of them. "Market rate for a 2-bedroom condo in this area is $2,950 per month. First month's rent plus last month's rent plus security deposit. Total of $8,850 due within 30 days if you want to continue living here." The silence in the room was deafening. Colin picked up his copy and stared at it like it was written in a foreign language. Frank's hands were actually shaking as he tried to focus on the small print. Deborah just sat there with he managed to say, and there was real disbelief in her voice. Like the idea that actions might have consequences was completely foreign to her. "No," I said calmly. "I'm offering you a legal contract to continue living in my property. That's more courtesy than you offered me when you decided to commit fraud to exclude me from a vacation I paid for." Rachel chose that moment to emerge from wherever she'd been hiding, probably hoping to avoid this confrontation entirely. She looked terrible, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt. The woman who'd been so excited about her dream vacation to Dubai now looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "Marcus," she said, and I could hear her trying to summon some of her old authority, the tone she used when she wanted me to back down from something. "This is petty. We had some problems with communication about the trip, but that doesn't mean you should punish my parents." Petty. There was that word again. Amazing how quickly something becomes petty when the person who's been getting away with bad behavior suddenly faces consequences for their actions. "This isn't punishment," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "This is business. Just like you treated our marriage when you decided my feelings didn't matter as much as making sure Asher got to go on a free vacation." Colin finally found his voice, though it came out weaker than usual. "Come on, man. We're family. You can't just—" "Family," I interrupted, and for the first time since I'd walked in, I let some of my real feelings show. Family doesn't commit fraud against each other. Family doesn't lie to airlines about medical emergencies. Family doesn't give away someone's seat on a vacation they planned and paid for because they think someone else would be more fun. I reached into my folder and pulled out printed copies of all the text messages, the airline fraud documentation, and my detailed accounting of exactly how much money they'd cost me over the years. I spread them across the coffee table like evidence in a courtroom. 4 years of free housing, $21,300 in unpaid rent, utilities, and maintenance. $30,000 for a Dubai vacation that you decided I didn't deserve to go on. Plus the additional costs you incurred when you got stranded because all the reservations I'd made were canceled. That's over $50,000 in direct costs, not counting opportunity costs or the value of my time spent dealing with your constant financial emergencies. Frank was staring at the documents like they contained evidence of war crimes. We never asked you to. No, you didn't ask. You just took. For years. And when I finally stood up for myself, you called it petty. I stood up and straightened my jacket. So here's the deal. You have 30 days to either sign this lease and start paying market rate rent like adults, or you can find somewhere else to live. Those are your only options. Deborah looked up at me with something that might have been hatred. You've changed, Marcus. This isn't the man Rachel married. She was right about that. The man Rachel married would have swallowed this insult, made excuses for their behavior, maybe even paid for another vacation to try to smooth things over. The man Rachel married was a doormat who prioritized keeping the peace over keeping his dignity. But that man was gone. He'd been killed the moment I got that text message telling me my seat was being given to someone more fun. You're absolutely right, I said, gathering up my documents. I have changed. I've learned what happens when you treat generous people like they're disposable. I've learned what family really means and what it doesn't. I headed for the door, then paused and turned back to face them one more time. Oh, and just so we're clear, if you decide not to sign the lease and don't vacate the property within 30 days, I'll be filing for formal eviction through the courts. That's a matter of public record, which means it'll show up on credit reports and rental applications for the next 7 years. Might make finding a new place to live a bit challenging. I let myself out and walked back to my car, feeling lighter than I had in years. Behind me, I could hear them starting to argue with each other, voices rising as the reality of their situation began to sink in. For the first time since this whole mess started, I was the one walking away from their drama instead of being stuck in the middle of it. And it felt damn good. 30 days. That's all I gave them to make a decision, and honestly, I knew exactly what choice they'd make before they did. People who've gotten comfortable taking advantage of someone's generosity don't suddenly develop a sense of responsibility just because you present them with a lease agreement. They double down, make excuses, and convince themselves that somehow, some way, they can manipulate the situation back to their advantage. The silence was deafening. Not a single phone call, not one email, not even a text message acknowledging that they'd received the lease or asking questions about the terms. For 30 days, Rachel's family acted like I'd never shown up at their door with a legal contract, like they could just ignore reality until it went away. Meanwhile, my security cameras were telling a different story. Colin was still coming and going like he owned the place, bringing home different women every few nights and leaving trash scattered around the property. Frank was still parking in the guest spot he'd been asked repeatedly not to use. Deborah was still hosting her weekly book club meetings in my living room, serving wine and cheese to her friends while they gossiped about neighborhood drama. They were living in complete denial, acting like nothing had changed, probably convincing themselves that I'd eventually back down like I always had before. After all, I was the accommodating son-in-law who'd been swallowing their disrespect for years. In their minds, this was probably just another phase I'd get over once I cooled down. They were wrong. On day 31, I called my attorney. Hal Parker had been handling real estate issues for me since I bought my first house, and he'd already been briefed on the whole Dubai situation when I'd initially consulted him about the fraud charges. He's one of those old-school lawyers who doesn't mess around with dramatics or emotional appeals, just cold, hard legal facts delivered with the kind of precision that makes judges pay attention. Time to file the eviction? Hal asked when I called him that Tuesday morning. Time to file the eviction, I confirmed. They never responded to the lease offer, never paid rent, never even acknowledged that they received the documents. I've got security camera footage showing continued occupancy without authorization. Perfect. I'll have the papers filed by the end of the week. Fair warning though, Marcus, this is going to get ugly. Family evictions always do. They're going to fight this, probably try to claim some kind of informal agreement or family relationship exception. He was right, of course. The moment they were served with official eviction papers, all hell broke loose. My phone started ringing at 6 in the morning with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, voicemails from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, text messages from Rachel's cousins and college friends telling me I was tearing the family apart. Frank left me a 20-minute voicemail that was equal parts pleading and anger, talking about how he'd always thought of me as a son, how he couldn't believe I'd turned so cold and heartless. He kept saying he didn't understand what had changed, like the months of planning a vacation only to be fraudulently excluded from it was some minor misunderstanding that shouldn't affect our relationship. Colin tried a different approach, showing up at my office building and waiting in the parking garage to ambush me after work. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "Dude, come on," he said, blocking my path to my car. "You're really going to throw us out on the street? Over some stupid vacation drama? Rachel's been crying for weeks. Mom's having panic attacks. Dad's talking about taking out loans just to find a place we can afford. You had 30 days to sign a lease," I told him, pulling out my car keys. "You chose not to. That's not my problem anymore. This is insane, man. We're family. You don't do this to family." There was that word again. Family. The magic word they thought would make me forget years of disrespect and financial abuse. The word they thought would erase the fact that they'd committed federal crimes to exclude me from a trip I'd paid for. "You're right," I said, unlocking my car door. "You don't do this to family. Which is why what you did in Dubai was so unforgivable." Deborah tried the guilt approach, sending me a handwritten letter that arrived on expensive stationery and probably took her hours to craft. She wrote about how disappointed she was in the man I'd become, how the Marcus she'd known for years would never have been so cruel to people who loved him. She talked about Rachel's broken heart, about Frank's declining health, about how stress was affecting everyone's mental state. But the letter that really got to me, not in the way she intended, but in the way that crystallized exactly why I was doing the right thing, came from Rachel herself. 3 pages of her neat handwriting, delivered to my office by courier, explaining why I was wrong, why I was overreacting, why I needed to drop the eviction and go back to the way things were. "You're destroying our marriage over pride," she wrote. "This isn't about the money or the Dubai trip anymore. This is about you needing to prove a point, and you're willing to hurt innocent people to do it. My parents didn't do anything wrong except try to make a difficult situation work for everyone. Innocent people. That's how she saw them. After everything they'd done, after the fraud and the lies and the years of financial abuse, she genuinely believed her parents were innocent victims of my unreasonable behavior." The court hearing was set for a Thursday morning in February. I showed up in my best suit with Hal and a folder full of documentation that told the complete story. Security camera footage, bank records showing years of unpaid rent, copies of the lease agreement they'd ignored, and yes, the fraud documentation from Emirates Airlines. Rachel's family arrived with a different lawyer, some guy in an expensive suit who probably cost them more per hour than they'd ever offered to pay me in monthly rent. They'd clearly spent money they didn't have trying to fight this, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. Judge Martinez was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd clearly seen every kind of landlord-tenant dispute imaginable. She listened to their lawyer argue about family relationships and informal agreements, about how evicting elderly parents would cause undue hardship. Then Hal presented our evidence. The bank records showing 4 years of free housing. The ignored lease agreement. The security footage of continued occupancy after legal notice to vacate. And when their lawyer tried to argue that family relationships created special circumstances, Hal pulled out the Emirates fraud documentation. "Your Honor," he said in that calm, measured voice that made every word sound like established fact, "this is not a case of a landlord trying to unfairly evict tenants. This is a case of individuals who committed federal fraud against the property owner, then refused to enter into any legal agreement for continued occupancy when offered the opportunity to do so." Judge Martinez read through the airline fraud report, looked at the timeline of events, and then fixed Rachel's family with the kind of stare that judges perfect after years of dealing with people who think rules don't apply to them. The defendants had 30 days to respond to a reasonable lease offer at market rates, she said. They chose not to respond. The plaintiff has provided clear documentation of unauthorized occupancy following proper legal notice. I'm granting the eviction order. Defendants have 14 days to vacate the property. That was it. For years of free housing, years of my accommodation and generosity, ended with a judge's gavel and a 14-day notice to quit. As we walked out of the courthouse, I could hear them arguing behind us, voices raised in the kind of desperate anger that comes when people finally realize their actions have consequences they can't charm or manipulate their way out of. Rachel caught up with me in the parking lot, her face streaked with tears, looking like someone had just told her the world was ending. "You've changed," she said, and there was something final in her voice, like she was pronouncing judgment on our entire relationship. "This isn't the man I married." "You're absolutely right," I told her, opening my car door. "The man you married would have let you get away with this. He would have paid for another vacation and pretended none of this ever happened. He would have spent the rest of his life being grateful for whatever scraps of respect your family was willing to throw his way." I got in my car and rolled down the window. "But that man is gone, Rachel. You killed him the day you gave his seat away. What you're looking at now is what's left." I drove away and left them standing in the courthouse parking lot, probably still trying to figure out how the accommodating pushover they'd been taking advantage of for years had suddenly developed a backbone. The eviction was final. The lesson was taught. And for the first time since I'd married into this family, I was the one walking away on my own terms. A year is a long time when you're rebuilding your life from scratch. Long enough to find out who you really are when you're not constantly accommodating other people's drama. Long enough to discover what peace feels like when you're not walking on eggshells around people who see your kindness as weakness. Long enough to realize that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is learn to say no to people who've never learned to hear it. I'd moved into a smaller place downtown, closer to work, with a view of the city that reminded me every morning that there was a whole world out there beyond Rachel's family dysfunction. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, split right down the middle with no drama because, frankly, there wasn't much to fight over once you removed my financial contributions from the equation. Rachel kept the house and the mortgage payments that came with it. I kept my sanity and my bank account. The condo had been rented to a nice young couple who actually paid their bills on time and treated the property with respect. Novel concept, right? Frank and Deborah had found a small apartment across town, and Colin had moved back in with them, which probably wasn't doing anyone's mental health any favors, but wasn't my problem anymore. I'd heard through mutual friends that the divorce had been hard on Rachel, that she'd been struggling with the reality of managing household expenses without my income to fall back on. Apparently, it's a lot harder to maintain a certain lifestyle when you're the one actually paying for it. Who could have predicted that? But I wasn't thinking about any of that on the Tuesday afternoon when they showed up at my office building. I was walking out to grab lunch when I saw them standing by my car in the parking garage. Rachel, Deborah, and Frank, looking like a delegation that had come to negotiate some kind of treaty. They looked older. All of them. Frank was using a walking cane now, and there was something fragile about the way he carried himself that hadn't been there before. Deborah had lost weight, and not in a good way. She looked worn down, like someone who'd been carrying stress for too long. Rachel looked tired, with lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Marcus," Rachel said as I approached, and I could hear her trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not here to fight. We need to talk to you about something." I stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to hear them, but far enough to make it clear this wasn't a friendly reunion. "What do you want?" Frank stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "Son, He caught himself, probably remembering that I wasn't his son anymore, that whatever relationship we'd had was another casualty of their choices. "Marcus, I'm having some health problems. My knee needs surgery, and the insurance is only covering part of it. The doctors say if I don't get it fixed soon, I might end up in a wheelchair permanently." I felt something twist in my chest, not quite sympathy, but not satisfaction either. Frank had always been the most decent one in Rachel's family, the one who treated me with genuine respect even when the others were treating me like hired help. Seeing him struggling with his health, seeing the pride it cost him to even be here asking for help, was harder than I'd expected. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "But I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it." A week after giving them that check for Frank's surgery, Deborah's text arrived like a final slap in the face. "Until you fix this, you're no longer family." No greeting. No thanks for the $3,000 I'd just handed them out of pure decency. Just another demand that somehow I was the one who needed to fix what they'd broken. I stared at those words and felt something click into place. She was absolutely right. I wasn't family anymore. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I didn't want to be. I stopped being family the day you sold my seat. I texted back. Then I did what I should have done months ago. I blocked her number. Frank's. Collins. And finally, after staring at her name for a full minute, Rachel's too. I drove to this little coastal inn I discovered during the divorce, paid cash for 3 nights, and told them no calls. For 3 days, I existed in complete silence. No phone, no drama, no contact with anyone who thought my kindness was weakness. On the final morning, I found an email from Ahmed at the Burj Al Arab. We would be delighted to welcome you back to Dubai. Perhaps for a solo traveler's experience this time. I smiled and typed back. I'm very interested. Let's talk about a booking for one. They'd given my seat to someone more fun. I'd given myself something better. A life where I didn't need anyone's permission to matter, where my worth wasn't measured by how much I was willing to sacrifice for people who wouldn't do the same for me. Sitting in my quiet apartment, planning a solo trip to Dubai, I realized that was the best trade I'd ever made. I kept my peace, and in the end, that turned out to be worth more than any seat at any table.